We're going to give a minute for everybody to come on board, and then we're going to start. So I wanted to welcome everybody to On the Park Bench, a public square conversation. On the Park Bench is a webinar series that CNU has been doing for the better part of a year. And we do it always on Tuesdays at 12 noon, not every week, but usually a couple of times a month. And within that webinar series, we have a series called the Authors Forum, which is all about discussing books that have to do with urbanism, written by urbanists, and of interest to this field. The Authors Forum producer is Duru Tudani, architect and urbanist. And without his hard work, we wouldn't have this series. So I wanted to thank Duru. Today's Authors Forum is on Increments of Neighborhood, a compendium of built types for walkable and vibrant communities by author Brian O'Looney. So you can share your thoughts on hashtag On the Park Bench and go to that URL on the screen for feedback. And you can register for our next two webinars, which are also authors forums. Tuesday, March 2nd, Transect Urbanism with author Andreas Duani and interviewer Charles Boll. And on Tuesday, March 16th, Main Street, How a City's Heart Connects Us with author Mindy Thompson, Full of Love, and interviewer Kennedy Smith. Those both look excellent. Go to cnu.org/resources/on the park bench. And I want to remind everybody about CNU 29, Design for Change. You need to register for that. The early bird registration is available through March 7th, and it really is an incredible bargain, especially if you've got a firm with several people attending. You really want to register by March 7th. CNU 29, Design for Change, May 19th through 21st will focus on the intersection of design and power. The power design holds to influence the way we live, to physically change and adapt the spaces we inhabit, as well as how we can use it to achieve the change we want to see in neighborhoods, towns, cities, and across regions. CNU 29 program will break the mold of previous Congresses with multiple formats that maximize the benefits of being held virtually and encourage creativity and innovation from participants. Learn more at cnu.org/CNU29. I'm really excited about this discussion today. We have a panel that between them probably has been involved in more charter award-winning projects than they can probably count. We have the author, Brian O'Looney of Increments of Neighborhood, and he is a principal with Torty Callison Partners, a major new urbanist design firm located in Silver Spring, Maryland. And before that, he also worked at a notable urban design firm, David Schwartz Architects. And we have the interviewers, Todd Zimmerman, who is a co-founder with his wife, Lori Voke of Zimmerman Voke Associates, a pioneering firm in the market research of residential building types in walkable neighborhoods. And we also have Matthew Bell, and the other interviewer, a professor of architecture at the University of Maryland, one of the significant pedagogues in the new urbanism field, and a principal at the private architecture firm Perkins Eastman. And I'm Rob Studeville, editor of CNU's online journal Public Square and senior communications advisor with the Congress for the New Urbanism. And today we're going to be talking about Increments of Neighborhood, a compendium of built types for walkable and vibrant communities. When I reviewed this book for Public Square back in March of 2020, the whole nation had shut down for COVID. And I was worried at the time that this book might be overlooked because nobody was really thinking much about urbanism at the time. But what I said was that every urban designer, planner, architect, and developer who is building urban places should have a copy of this book, and that at every charrette where you're designing walkable neighborhoods or portions of walkable neighborhoods, there should be this book available, because it literally talks about the building blocks of what you need to build neighborhoods, and it talks about them in such a way that it's incredibly useful, beautifully put together. This is not just a book, but it seems like it's a result of a career in urban planning and designing neighborhoods. And Brian O'Looney has been involved in scores, if not hundreds, of designs of walkable neighborhoods in similar places. So before I turn this over, I will inform everybody that that we are going to be doing a presentation, then a discussion among the three panelists today, and then we're going to go to Q&A from the audience. And so as questions occur to you, please ask them using the Q&A function of Zoom, not the chat function. You can make a comment in chat, but use the Q&A function for the questions, because that's how these questions are going to be organized during the general Q&A. So we'll get to that Q&A as soon as possible, but first I wanted to pass this over to Brian so that he can give his presentation.
Okay, well, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. So I was asked by Diru and Rob, and thank you for inviting me to present this book. It's an honor to be amongst such other great publications that this series has talked through, and excited to talk about this book today. And so anyway, I was asked by Diru and Rob to talk a little bit about the goals of putting the book together and why we put the book together. I think we recognized there needed to be a resource at the beginning of assembling this book. And it was partly a reaction to a great article written by Chris Lineberger about the kinds of building types that were getting financed in the late 90s, and what, if one wanted to become a developer, what one can go out to do. And he identified, for the purposes of trying to have the community identify types that were contributing to walkable places, he identified what he called the 19 types of 19 standard product types that were being financed and getting built. And those 19 types are on the slide today in this grid. They include for sale housing types, which were starter homes, and he had a different definition than we might have defined, but he had what was called a move-up home and a luxury home, and a retirement facility and vacation homes, really defined by market segments that a bank or investor might be looking to address. And then he had the income products he identified as in retail, neighborhood shopping centers, regional shopping malls, big box power centers, and then in the office market, build-to-suit office, medical office, multi-tenant bulk warehouses, and finally multifamily buildings or hotel buildings. And what was interesting about the 19 types, as we went through working through this book, they're all supported by one other type, which was the type of surface parking that contributed to the public realm, and that makes up these suburbs that we reacted to in putting this book together. We wanted to answer the challenge with this book, so we looked at the neighborhoods that we love and are charmed by, And so this is an image of Georgetown that John Todd uses in a lot of his presentations for our office. And it shows the variety of types that contribute to this one neighborhood. There's a big mansion in the center, but they're surrounded by some multifamily, some mixed-use retail buildings, and other kinds of walk-up townhouses, converted townhouses to stack product. There's a wide range that makes this rich fabric unique and charming. Similarly, in short north of the core of Columbus, you have a neighborhood that again has that mix of types, a lot of which have changed their relationship to the street over time. So they might have started out as a townhouse, but then were converted to stacked flats or had retail brought into the ground floor over time. Here's a view in San Francisco of Broadway, near where I grew up in New London, Connecticut, and then Chicago, which has a very different range of types. And so what we wanted to do was compile types that were today contributing to neighborhood, to the kinds of communities that we love to be in and wanted to be a part of. And so we had particular attributes that those who are interested in walkable urbanism are extremely familiar with. We wanted active street frontages that were pedestrian oriented, that had engagement with the street frontages, that had doors on the street, connectivity, and allowed for personal ownership and occupancy. Even if they rented the product, that there was an opportunity to buy into the place. And that was something we learned as we were putting the book together that was important to defining the types, the difference between the types that contribute to walkable place and those that don't. And so we started to compile the types over many years and then started to group them. It was interesting. Of the types that we collected, there's 140 in the book, only 33% are from greenfield new urbanist projects. The rest are infill product that had been built over the last 20 years. Another thing we learned was that the types often reinforce one another, and we can talk about that a little later. But there starts to be a little influence, like pieces on a chessboard influence one another in the neighborhood. We wanted to present successful implementations of each type. So we looked hard for the best exemplar of the type. And in some cases, we had a hard time, and the best example is, has some issues with the way they react to the street or otherwise. We also showed bad examples, and we called those missed opportunities to describe what could be problematic or what could be improved. We tried to show plans. We tried to show them in construction. When I was in school, I wish I saw more buildings naked to better understand what was behind what we see in our public realm. And so part of the spreads for each of the types show the buildings being constructed. And this is a range of building types here that contribute to cores all over city cores all over the United States and Canada. Each of them have a huge impact on cost. And so the construction type on the right is more than double the cost of the construction type of the single family home that we're all familiar with. And that has huge implications for what we do when we build neighborhoods. And it has nothing to do with style, nothing to do with public realm. It has to do with the core elements that make the community. And so that was an important thing we wanted to highlight. And I wish I knew more about and was taught more when I was in school. We ended up focusing on market vetted types, which means they were not patron sponsored types. So the types are distilled to their essence. And that's interesting because it shows the range and that there is still a need for architecture and art. We worked with RCLCO in helping to put numbers on these types to understand their place in the market. And one of the partners there had a very interesting comment, was that when you do that, you start to see the value the architecture adds. And you can start to understand that when the types are distilled down. So each of the types can be elaborated to become a custom home, or a branded, or a pad site can become a branded retail building, or a urban office building can certainly become a corporate headquarters. But we didn't add those as types. Those are elaborations that we can find out there. So we tried to distill down, and we're guided in many ways, and thought of it in terms of sort of the crutches of architecture that Philip Johnson had talked about, and really distilling down to all these items: the structure, the utility, the cheapness, the comfort, and serving the client, and delving into history a little bit in drawing, but really was more about the core essence that contributes to the neighborhood and community. And then finally, we wanted types that we want to share successful compilations of type to allow folks to go out and say, wow, we can mix these together and make great neighborhoods. The example on top is from my office. The example in the lower right is from a Mul Polyzoides. And in that Mul Polyzoides example, there's everything but the kitchen sink type-wise mixed into that one project at Del Mar. There's a double-loaded quarter multifamily building, an office building, retail, stack flats, and towns, all making an incredible destination at the Del Mar train station in South Pasadena. And the plan on the left, the lower left, is one of my partner, Cheryl, Neal, and Murphy Antoine put these plans together. And again, the colors represent the different types that start to establish the richness of the neighborhood. And this is a campus community at George Mason University. And then finally, wanted to expand the notion of missing middle. There's a lot of talk about missing middle, but that talk is really focused on housing. And the interesting charm of the neighborhoods that I talked about at the beginning, or neighborhoods, particularly like in Philadelphia, where the end grain always has retail built in, is that the market, through the specialization that Chris Lineberger identified, had moved away from these softer retail types that had been used to warm up and enliven neighborhoods. And they're still allowable under the building codes and can happen. And so this is another Tortigalis example where this is a wood building with residential above retail, and it's wood with, and you can see the construction in the middle image, but it has a Starbucks in the bottom, and a liquor store and a convenience store built into it. And it serves the neighborhood well, and it doesn't have to be expensive. And so that was another goal of putting this book together. And with that, I'm excited that it seems to have been received well, and I look forward to questions from everybody here today.
Well, great, Brian. I guess, first of all, excuse me, congratulations on the book. It's a very, very impressive work. And it is a lot of work to put a book together. And I can imagine having all the stresses and strains of practice, it's a lot of work to putting a book together while you're trying to put buildings together as well. So kudos to you for making that all happen. I guess I get the first question here. It's kind of an obvious one. How do you think people should use this book? Or maybe the converse, how should they not use the book? What are the ways you think the book is useful, and to the different kinds of people who might be interested in it?
Yeah. Again, I hope people would learn about more types, and I hope it would appeal to broad audiences. I can see it being used by students, but also to, for developers to show to bankers of examples of where where types have been built that they may have been unfamiliar with or not clear about. I think planners can use it to better understand how the building code impacts what gets built. The tranches that are developed in the book are relative to what the building code allows. And actually the image here, these types come from where the tranches that the building code forces upon buildings. And maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. But how the book can get abused, I don't know. Someone could try to analyze it to find the one type that maximizes land value and do a whole plan of that type. That clearly would be a misuse of the book. I think the idea of the book is to understand the to lessen the fear about particular types and to better understand them, to empower folks to use them in their work, either to infill in cities or to master plan new places.
Terrific.
Yeah, this book is extraordinary. You reminded me this morning that 9 years ago we had a conversation about some of the details. You were aspirational at that point. The whole reality of putting it together hadn't kicked in. The idea of axonometric drawings at the same scale for every type, which would be wonderful. But I will say that the common layout, the 1 to 500 aerials, I think are absolutely spectacular. I complain about the size of the book. Perhaps you can tell us whether the ebook is coming out. Will it be available? Because that would be ideal.
It is officially out apparently on Apple Books now. So you can, if you have the Apple Books icon on your phone, you can click on it and get the digital version, which will allow you to enlarge it. And yeah, you've already identified one of the challenges. As we were developing the book, we had always worked on the 8.5 by 11 size because it seemed like the best handbook size. But when our last copy reviewer asked to see it, she asked for it enlarged on 11 by 17. So we printed it out in 11 by 17 and it became more alive. And if we ever get to do a future edition hardcover or hard print again, we'll do it larger. But the digital version does resolve that because you can zoom into the plans and see them at a larger scale. And it should be somewhere around $30 for the digital version. So that hopefully it's meant to be.
Everybody should have one. Everybody. This is the thing about. I wish that every volunteer zoning commission had this. Certainly, Matt talked about, or maybe Brian, you talked about developers talking to financiers. I have the problem oftentimes of developers talking to builders. They say, we can't build that. Well, you open book to page 43 and there it is, built.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point. My teacher in college or in graduate school, once when we had an architect come give a talk and he was trashing the idea of typology, this was Colin Rowan, he said that's absurd because every banker knows what typology is all about, which struck me as a pretty insightful thing. And I think typology is something that really doesn't get taught very well in schools. Even in my own school, where we profess to have an urban focus, I think typology is still something that is oftentimes at the outer fringes of what the curriculum is. So getting to that, Brian, did you start this by analyzing historic fabric? You touched on that a little bit in your intro, and then see how they developed into contemporary market types? Or sort of a chicken and the egg question, collect current market types and then trace back the historical DNA? Because, obviously these are all things that one sees in the marketplace today, but they all do have relationships to historical antecedents, or at least do all the types in the book, do you think have some DNA that is historical?
Yeah, that's a great question, Matt. I mean, we looked at types that we were collecting types and realized pretty early on that we wanted it to be present. We didn't want criticism of, well, that's a type that got built in 1945 and you couldn't do that today. Similarly, we didn't want any types that were visionary and thought. I mean, there's some great things that we've seen drawn that haven't been built. And we didn't include those either because we wanted it to be about what has been implemented well or what has been implemented successfully. And by having a book focused on that, we felt there was some power to that message. And so basically it's post-seaside development that's compiled in the book, and mostly North American. There are a couple Australian and New Zealand examples because their market tracks similarly to the North American market. And so we felt including them where there are examples built that don't exist anywhere else was appropriate.
I like your your seaside thing. You have before seaside and after seaside as a way to measure the change in the world.
Yeah. One of the things that intrigued me, because our practice is wholly housing. We're very opinionated about everything else, but housing is our thing. And live work, which to us is a function rather than a type. The townhouse with a convertible or commercial ground floor is a very, very different creature if it's owner occupied versus income property. Did you make distinctions in tenure, renter versus owner, when you were organizing your types?
We didn't. We felt it was it provided broader access if it was tenure neutral. There are types that tend to be predominantly rental, and there are types that tend to be predominantly for sale, but it's almost always never the case that one is a purely for sale and one is a purely rental product. And so by being agnostic to that, I think it allowed the accessibility for the reader to decide the appropriateness in their market, in their world state, what would be appropriate. And in their time, it may be that, post-COVID, some of these types may have changed already in terms of their applicability to be a rental or a for sale product. And I think it allows the book a little more timelessness not to talk about that, other than to say in certain cases that this is predominantly a rental type for these reasons. So, and that is spelled out in some of the narratives for each of the types.
Right. You're seeing the shift. If anyone saw our park bench earlier about the shift from owner to rental, as obviously most prevalent in the single family detached house, where big builders are getting into building purpose-built rent. But the idea of being completely agnostic is excellent.
Yeah, the residential mixed use section is very rich and layered with formal types and ideas. Well, I would say the difference between that and the civic section seems more to be based on functional differences rather than the relationship between the actual form of the buildings and the program. Is the result, I'd like to hear you talk about this, the result of your focus in your practice, or does the notion of type lend itself to a more consistent thread of analysis when you have a residential program, as all are part of the type, as compared to civic buildings that have more varied programs and perhaps less typologically derived formal possibilities?
Yeah, it's a little more banal than that. It's a great insight, Matt, and I'll have to give you a little background on how the book came together. Originally, it was only meant to be market types. And I was actually working with a different, more academic publisher before we partnered with Oro. And that publisher said, you really should include public types in this volume. And so it was actually probably a year or two added to the process, if not 3, of putting the book together to assemble the public types. Again, this was a team that put this together. So, Peyton Chung, who was on the team, was really helpful, had a lot of good, he's former CNU employee, really had a lot of insights on great buildings that contributed to the public realm, like your school in the upper right here. And it ended up being that the public building types were meant to be exemplars of the type as opposed to really telling the story. So there was a difference in the way they got assembled versus the private sector, where we had multiple options to choose from, and we're in most cases, and we're trying to either find the nuances that define the type. But like in the Dunbar School, it's incredibly impressive how that building there was a school there before, as you know, that really turned its back to the neighborhood. And then the new building really does its best to reach out on all sides and re-engage the neighborhood in an incredibly strong way. And it is truly an exemplar of how you can build a high school with all its land needs in the heart of a city. And that's why it's in the book, as in all the other public examples. In the lower left image is David Schwartz's Bass Hall in Fort Worth, Texas. Again, how to squeeze a concert hall on a super tight 200 by 200 foot site in the city. Just go over the images that are on the screen. The Milwaukee public market, that one building reinvigorated an entire neighborhood on the south side of the city, and similar with the what was the MCI Center, then became the Verizon Center. I think it's got a new name now, in the heart of DC. Again, brought the whole neighborhood around it because it was engaging in a way. It had active doors along all the frontages. It did all these things that truly, if someone is thinking about how to invigorate a neighborhood, these are the kinds of examples we would want folks to look at. And so I thank Peyton for that. Other contributors to the book on the transit types, which we can talk about a little bit later, Nat Bottenheimer, who used to be the head planner at WMATA here in DC, really helped us coalesce our thinking about what transit comparables are out there, particularly when you're thinking about that in relation to privatized mobility that impacts neighborhood quality. And that was powerful. And then Alex Dixon helped with the lower end of the scale, where she's very passionate about single family homes and stack product. And Kelly Mangold at RCL Co. helped us put together all the data particularly on the private sector types, to try to get a good comparative. We used 2010 numbers for the comparative. I'm really glad we did, because who would have known when this book came out, the market would do a flip like it did. But by having that, we were able to sort of, the numbers work reasonably well for suburban DC, but the point is that the relative nature between the types in putting that together. And so having a team to put this book together was really powerful, because we were able to bounce ideas off each other and make it richer through those thoughts and each of those contributors' considerations that they know, like if it wasn't for Peyton, the library section would not have been as strong. And I learned so much about what's happened to the library in a post-internet time that we've got in the book, and that's great.
I envy your ability to have spent a decade with a close examination of types. It's so rich, and yet it's a springboard for so much else. I noticed, for example, that there, or at least maybe I missed it, it is a very, very dense book, but the relationship to the street and what's opposite the street, again, from a housing perspective, one of the big no-nos that actually John Torty mentioned very early on, don't have a front-loaded lot facing a rear-loaded lot. And John Anderson was always very eloquent about the phenomenon of looking at an open garage door like you're sitting across from someone in one of those alternate facing seats on a train, and the guy's falling asleep with his mouth open, which is a kind of a vivid description. But if that close examination of these types, what did you learn during that whole process? Was there something that really stands out?
Well, a couple of things. One, we had to sort of divide I had to learn about courtyard types and what makes them, and in order to provide a good home for them in the book. And we broke them up into multiple places based on the types that form the courtyard. So it turns out there's a single family courtyard type, and a townhouse courtyard type, and a stacked housing courtyard type, and then more complex courtyard types. That was one lesson. John Anderson, who you just mentioned, introduced me to Dan Camp. And again, here's a so sad loss of COVID. He passed away because of the disease this year. But to this project, what he did in the Cotton District is astounding, in inventing all these, or reinventing or rebringing to life these super small scale student housing types that make a neighborhood. It's incredibly rich. And there are 3 spreads in the book solely due to Dan Camp's passion for what he did at the Cotton District. And so I met and learned about him and those types through John Anderson and Dan Camp. And that was one thing I learned, very powerful. I also learned a little bit about the power of, a little bit about public policy and public policy gone awry, which you can see in all the images here. The left is a communist example, but the right are all American examples. Top one is purely private. The bottom one is public, and the one in the middle is a public-private partnership. But they all devastated their neighborhoods with a misguided intrusion and imposition, where the Hope 6 program, thought and whether, came up with an approach that was more incremental and then invited people to participate and own each of their neighborhoods. And these are all Toy de Gaulle examples here. There's also some military housing at the bottom of the screen. But the point of the slide is to say that these became neighborhoods that were owned and express a worldview of the communities they're in, and are owned and beloved of the communities that they're in. And that's a powerful thing, that when you think incrementally and you empower a policy incrementally, can cause strength. Another great example, which I'd previously learned about but only had thought about in these terms, was the J51 program in New York City, which took completely abandoned and forlorn neighborhoods that are now the most expensive addresses in New York City, in Chelsea and the West Village, and reinvigorated them through a policy that was an incremental policy. It allowed smaller developers to come in and create investments that brought in artists and folks that believed in the city, and then enrich those places and made them come alive again. So I thought that was something I learned about in putting the book together.
So probably a lot of people here listening are designers, and they probably deal with lots of different kinds of types. My experience is that developers sometimes specialize. They want to do their product, and they know everything about their product, but they don't know too much about what somebody else does. So I guess one question that all this talk about type brings, if one assumes that the good city is comprised of many diverse types, any thoughts about the challenges that you see in terms of the aggregation of diverse types in terms of making city fabric? Because a lot of folks who are, in CNU are really interested in how these things go together to make place and make neighborhoods and make these challenges of aggregation.
It's a good question. I didn't, again, we were just, the focus of the book was more empowering with the types and allowing others to aggregate. I mean, again, I could go back to the example of Del Mar, where an incredibly rich neighborhood was formed through that type. I think the questions of tenure are always a challenge in aggregation. If you have a larger developer, they tend to be focused on one market segment, as you said, and that's always an issue. We find that that there's we're lucky in our firm that there's broad, we do affordable as well as high-end market rate housing, and we learn lessons of both, and those lessons are brought to bear as actually exemplified on the images on the screen now, which are for the most part all affordable, and the lower ones are all military, which is effectively affordable housing. And but yet you can take some high design details and apply them to a box at a very efficient and cost-effective price point, and create charming neighborhoods that bring up all boats. That the neighborhoods around these are much stronger now for these buildings to be there, even though the primary audience, not the only audience, were former affordable residents. These are all, many of them, because they're Hope 6, have, of course, mixed tenures, and that empowers those neighborhoods. And I would hope in the future that there are more opportunities for mixed tenure projects. But that is the true charm of the Hope. One of the great lessons from Hope 6 that I hope could be repeated in future policy.
It certainly stands to argue in terms of type that if the buildings all look great on the outside, you can't always tell where the affordable is, which is, I think, the sort of neighborhoods that you want. Yeah. That when one pays attention to those details, the stigmatization that we used to be so good at practicing on the poor can go away. And I think that's one of the great lessons.
Yeah, that is so true. Brian, it's been a year now, and since the book was released, and so many people have contacted you, and I think that you've probably looked at it for different eyes. Do you think you missed anything? Are there types that have come to light? Are there new types? What's the next one going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, so there were some types, like we had a type on the board I can pull up in a second, that we couldn't include because it wasn't built yet, and we were rigorous about only including implemented types. There are some other things that are out there, and here's a slide that shows you of some examples. So the upper left image is a 1.5 over 1.5. There's a version of this being built by Pulte in New Jersey in a project we're working on, and hopefully trying to get this done in Texas as well. That isn't in the book because we didn't know of an example of it. There's an image, there's a lot of changes happening in parking, in the in storage and parking storage. And so I would expect if, particularly with there's these tray systems now that are coming to fore that might need a spread in the future. The images on the right are a very impressive type that was built in Philadelphia. These are from the neighborhood development Facebook group, where we had a long conversation about whether it met code, and those numbers in the stairwell are to measure the length of travel distance to the furthest most point in the unit, and to see if this building actually worked. And there was some contention as to that in the conversation on that Facebook group. But that's a type that was impressive, and that came out too late to be in the book. And if we did another version, I'd probably want to talk to that. Here's another one. This is built in only a mile from our office in Upper Georgia Avenue. This is a 3-unit stacked building. One of my teammates calls this the ant farm unit on the right. But again, this wasn't included in the book, but I could see us talking about it. A very complex building that, again, just squeezed into the code, a very interesting product. So there are types out there. I'm sure there are more. I hope that in talking about the book, other people will make me aware of types. So if there's another edition, we can put the best examples out there for folks.
Brian, we should probably be getting into a Q&A from the audience. I wanted to remind everybody to use the Q&A function of Zoom to ask your questions.
We have actually 3 questions that kind of tie together. Question about types for suburban infill, for small locations of rural areas, and what have been implemented in smaller communities. The idea of using what types would be best to help repair the damage of the auto-oriented dendritic form.
That's a great question. I think hopefully, if anything, to answer your question now and Matt's question earlier, I hope that the book will allow for more site-specific responses. I think there's folks who know townhouse development have an opportunity to redevelop a suburban site, and often will look at it through their townhouse development eyes, or their single-family eyes, or their multifamily eyes, and to see other versions that aren't as strongly promoted, like stacked housing. I'm hopeful that that might open up opportunities both for to create a wider range of housing opportunity and meet the needs of more lifestyles and more folks in different stages of life, but also to provide comfort again with those types, particularly the stacked types, which I don't think are they have challenges, but they're easily built by home builder groups. And if there's any, those are the kinds of groups that would be looking at those infill sites, and to have the home builder have a copy of the book and have them see, hey, this isn't a bad idea. This is something we can do. Is an opportunity I hope we open up for folks.
We have one question that is kind of related. The question is, types that would be most relevant, again, increment of neighborhood in more rural areas. This questioner is asking about the state of Maine.
In
Types with fireplaces.
yeah, I mean, you would segue towards the more the single family realm of the book, and I think also there are some types that are coming out. There's another set of types that are coming out now that we really didn't capture in the book, which are there's some developers working in rental single family, and that's becoming again in places where land is relatively inexpensive, a new market, because there are folks who want the notion of the home, but would prefer being in a rental arrangement. And I think there's some interesting types being arrived at in that world, in that space now, that could meet some challenges in more rural places and more rural communities.
I have a question about the small apartment building, the 4, 6, even 12 unit building is so hard to get built because of financing. Mm-hmm. Why is it hard to convince developers that it's a perfect fit for single family neighborhoods? You know, we've always suggested that you could have a block with a mansion apartment building living perfectly comfortably on the corner with some townhouses and single family detached houses.
I don't know how to answer that question. I mean, I think there's, again, I think it's just exposure. And so this is, I'm trying to get to a 12plex, but on my screen, I hope you see there's these 6plexes that are quite powerful. I think, again, it's really about broadening the notion of what can be built in this, here's a 12plex, in the world of in today's finance realm. I think, I mean, oftentimes the money, you know, bankers are looking for the best return, and that typically is not a 12plex. It's a lot of groupings of 12plexes or multifamily building. This, you know, a 12plex is really just one component of a walk-up building. And so what we showed that this is an example of one just built on its own, and you could easily do that in a number of places, and it could contribute. I think there, you know, what we didn't show here, which we could have found, and maybe for the next edition we would find, is one that's a little more residential scaled. The 6plex has some, and the 4plex has some that you know, this is a 4plex that looks like a house. And there are other examples, you know, of, this is a corner unit that is this is a 9-unit corner building that looks like a house. And so one of the reason we use the word increments instead of type is partly because you can clothe you can take a single family home and put many units in it, and that is an increment for the community of a single family home, and not an increment of a 5 as a 4plex or a 6plex. And so part of, you know, the distinction of the word increment versus type is that the increment is the impression on the community and on the public realm. And so that's the you know, we use that term in our practice, and so that's what we wanted to talk about here, because we think, you know, just as you can take a row of townhouses and make them stand out individually, you can also take a row of townhouses and express them as one building, so that it is a good neighbor to a larger multifamily or more civic building next door. And that's an important lesson to know when one is crafting neighborhood, and a lesson we were hoping to impart with the book.
And here's where tenure comes in again, because we've been advocating the mansion apartment building, which we define as 4 and 6 units of the same scale as a large house, as a way to get around the challenges of development and construction finance for condominiums, because, you know, you need to get certain pre-sales to get the thing built. If it's only 4 units, it's easier to do, and it's a wonderful increment. The developers who are building neighborhoods rental communities that look like neighborhoods. You wouldn't know what the tenure is as you walk down the street, because they're composed of everything from, say, a 12-plex all the way down to detached or duplexes.
I mean, Brian,
Matt,
have you found, well, I was just going to ask along the lines of where you guys are going. Have you found, you're sort of talking about the dressing of the building as compared to the type, how it's dressed, right? And have you found that a lot of ways these buildings, how they're dressed, allows you to introduce greater density in context where if the building looked more like a traditional apartment building, it would be opposed by the neighbors, but the fact that its dressing is more commensurate with the sort of context around it allows that type to actually enjoy a more fruitful relationship to its neighbors and therefore get approved.
Yes, and there are some great examples of that. So down in the lower right-hand part of the screen on the spread for the sixplexes, there are these wonderful sixplexes at Miller in Austin, which has a really low residential scale. It fits in and segues to single family and stacked and towns, but are all, even the towns and the single family are, the towns and the stacked are in a single family form, and it makes a great neighborhood. And you really have to look out for it to realize, oh, wait a minute, that is a sixplex building there. It's not a single family home. And this may help communities in the future also address affordability concerns and notions. I mean, you can in single family areas, there are a variety of ways of addressing that. Obviously, the back unit, there's ways you can incorporate them into the main building, but there's also ways you can incorporate them either as a granny flat or other kind of smaller unit in the or a tiny home that's on the backyard. And there are a lot of great architects working to incorporate that, and a lot of codes that are becoming more flexible for units to extend livability in the suburbs for folks that are not in the prime single family audience of a couple with 2 kids. And so there's some stretching happening, and these types can help stretch in a different way than is typically considered with granny flats and their ilk in single family neighborhoods.
I have a question about broadening the discussion of buildings or configurations that are easily convertible from residential to commercial or vice versa. I was delighted to see in your book that you selected the mezzanine loft as the perfect ground floor type for those awkward situations where there's not enough retail to fill the ground floor, but you want to have the 16-foot plate height and the ability to convert gracefully at a 0 entry for residential to the required 0 entry for retail. Stephanie Bothwell mentions that there's a great deal of pressure in Georgetown with the rash of applicants that come for approval as residential over commercial, but quickly convert to residential because of the present market condition. What are the elements that need to be included to go both ways?
Yeah, so that's a refined aspect of the building code where the building is considered initially. So typically in the world of construction today, for a cost-effective mixed-use building, you would have 4 stories or 5 stories of wood over a concrete podium. It used to be that podium can only be 1 story. Now that podium can be multiple stories on the lower level, as long as it's within a certain height. In terms of the type 5 wood construction world, it's 65 feet, I believe. And then if it's a type 3, you can go up to 85 feet plus or minus. We can talk about that later. But what's interesting is that besides now being allowed to do multiple levels in that podium, you can also do a mezzanine in that podium area. And a mezzanine is a little different section of the code. If the space is of a certain size in relation to the space below, you can build that space up into the top, and it doesn't count as an extra floor. And so sometimes that's something you can do, and that was the example you're citing from the book in the mixed use buildings. I can go dig out if we really want to look at it. But there are a number of devices one can use so that you can fill in that lower podium day one. Say if the market isn't quite there, you're building out a whole neighborhood, you eventually expect to have 10,000 people, but you only have a few thousand day one, you can put residential units in that space. And then when that neighborhood's built out and you know you have the need for more commercial, just like any tenant fit out, those units could be gutted and turned into retail or commercial or doctor's offices. And so that's something that we talk about in the book. And we have a number of types that allow for that. Again, flexible retail is an important part of what the missing middle.
You know, talking about flexibility, Brian, a colleague of mine once said that the best urban building is the loft because it is the most flexibility for living or work. What are the challenges of flexibility? I mean, you know, some of these types, I think you said in the intro, the more towards the lower end of the spectrum, the less flexible they are and things like that. Are we headed into a time when we need that flexibility? And if so, what sort of things should we be doing?
Yeah, it's a huge issue because people need to understand, Matt, it's really insightful, to make residential flexible into the future for other uses, it has to be built slightly more expensive. You typically, most residential is built out of wood stick construction. And in order to make it a commercial use, you typically want it to be a little more stout, either protected steel or concrete. Doesn't always have to be, and we have precedents in here, as I showed earlier, that can be done in wood if you're thoughtful about it. And that is a way of succeeding. But to do a loft building, it needs to be primarily, for the moment, primarily a concrete frame or steel frame, and then you infill with the units. And that concrete frame or steel frame is more expensive. However, there is a lot of talk about changing the building codes so that type 4, which is post and beam, heavy wood construction, can be used to be built taller. And you're seeing all these stories about wood high rises. Well, that's requiring a change in the building codes, and that change would allow more of that flexibility so that you can have an easier change from resi to commercial uses. And so that's an exciting, sustainable,
and a more sustainable price point. Yeah, price point. Yeah,
absolutely right.
Sure.
And so those are that's an innovation that's happening in the building codes to address the concerns that we're seeing in society. So yeah,
we're coming up on the hour, and we're prepared to continue. I wanted to get one question in from Professor Chuck Bowl at the University of Miami, who said there's a large group of real estate development students. Can you provide additional remarks on how aspiring real estate developer professional can learn from and use the book in their work? E.g. translating, matching up calculations of max lot coverage and square foot, market segmentation, bedrooms and baths and amenities into more varied and context appropriate building types. You have 2 minutes.
Okay. Well, the book's organized in a way that allows generally the front of the book are the less expensive types. Actually, let me see if I have a slide I can share on the breadth of product. Yeah, here. If you can see my screen, really understanding the cost per square foot is critical to evaluating what you can do and what you can deliver. And this is the range here with the sort of the fully clothed buildings up top and the naked ones below. And each tranche allows you more to build, but at the same time limits. It's more expensive, so your profits are minimized. And so knowing what the right tranche is for where you're building is really important, not just for developers and young real estate students, but particularly planners. I can't tell you how many well-meaning new urbanist plans we've seen where the intention of the zoning envelopes do not correlate with the prescriptions of the building code. And so these are the tranches here on the screen of the building code, where you can do residential code, and you can do 3 stories. You can do type 5 wood construction. You can put it over a podium. You can do type 3 wood construction, which comes from the Chicago heritage with masonry walls and wood floors. In New Jersey, it's still masonry walls and wood floors, but in a lot of the country, the drywall industry has come up with a 2-hour wall that supplants that, and so that you can build a fully drywall building in type 3. The next tranche is type 1B, which we're seeing a lot in Denver, where you take this sort of hotel light gauge type and put it on top of a concrete podium and get a building out of that. And that seems to be the next increment. And that, using different meaning of the word increment, where you can go up to 12 stories and 120 feet with that compilation. And then after that, there are these modular construction types like tunnel form. And then beyond that, there are steel and frame construction types. You can see there's a price to be paid for each of those types, and understanding where those price points are and what the limitations are really critical in general. And I hope the book helps people understand that.
So we are up at the 1 hour point right now, and we still have more questions, and we can continue our conversation. For those who need to peel off, we're going to post the entire video tomorrow, and you can watch the remaining discussion then if you have a question that you wanted to have answered. For everybody else, we can continue for a little while with more questions, and you can keep on asking questions in the Q&A section. Thanks.
Okay, we're deep in the professorial area of questioners. Professor Talon from Chicago asks, are SketchUp models of the building types available, and could you contribute them to the SketchUp for New Urbanism resource started by the late, great Bill Dennis?
Wow, I'm getting hit with every hole that we put in the book. Unfortunately not. We try, at the beginning we started, and it was just too much work to try to do SketchUp for everyone, all the types in the book. So unfortunately, they're not available. That was a hope, but it didn't happen for the book, unfortunately. But it would be great if over the time, if SketchUp versions of each of the types become available, we'd love to compile them and share them. We actually, in the spreads, we actually had a place for them originally as we were putting it together, and then ended up having to pull it out. The way the book is assembled, let me show a spread. These are parking spreads. The right page was meant to pinwheel depending on the number, how much information we had, the different categories of information we wanted to present. And so we always have that scale image in the upper right, and construction photos and plans, and depending on what's available or what the best imagery is relative to the type, we grow or shrink on that page to best communicate the most pertinent information. And in the end, we just squeezed the SketchUp models out of the spreads, regrettably. I would love to see a SketchUp model. I mean, we have, obviously, there's SketchUp models for the types that are out there, and certainly in the SketchUp for New Urbanism has plenty, but we did not end up doing a range of SketchUp models for the types that are in the book.
That could be volume 2 there, Brian, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have had a suggestion about aggregation as a focus for volume 2.
It's a great question. I mean, we honestly, that was part of what drove the book. I mean, I had a wonderful conversation early on, actually at the CNU in West Palm Beach with Stefanos Palazoidis about aggregation and about describing and breaking down the courtyard types. But you know, the work they do in their projects, it's so well considered in terms of how they aggregate the different types to craft neighborhood and craft place and craft realms that are comfortable and joyous. You know, Seven Fountains is the exquisite example of that extreme consideration and thought. And there are other examples of that.
the Seven Fountains is a marvelous example of how quality of public space trumps all of the market shibboleths. There's a unit that I think is 92 steps from parking up that is at the top of Seven Fountains that's getting, I think, $6 a foot in a market that is $4 a foot market. Another suggestion is, I suspect that this is already an alliance that is well along its way, but someone suggested that it'd be interesting to pair this work, this thinking, with the work of the Incremental Development Alliance to provide a boot camp workshop.
I am a big fan of the Incremental Development Alliance. I'm a member of the Facebook group, learn a lot, love to share there, and would be happy to contribute in any way we can to promote and empower more people who are out there trying to do this on the ground. Absolutely.
The last question I have here, actually, we're ending at a much more reasonable time, is actually is one that's ripe for discussion. The writer suggests that these are creative designs, wonderfully creative designs, but presumably for new development projects, thinking perhaps greenfields, I'm not sure. But can you speak to re-incentivizing older neighborhoods without cultural loss? That is, working with older neighborhoods versus replacing them.
I couldn't have a more perfect example on the screen than this parking garage. Here, I'm going to blow it up. This is in Leesburg, Virginia. This is part of the amazing City Hall complex. That's there. What's really fascinating, it just happens to be a staggered tier garage, but it is integrated so well into the neighborhood. There's circulation paths that come off the main street that lead to it. It ties into the City Hall exceedingly well. So there's two types married together, it's just a great way of responding to historic context. Actually, again, the interesting thing about the book is the majority of examples are infill and not new greenfield. And that was, I didn't even realize that until the end. I was asked a question about, well, how much of this is infill? Most of it is infill. I'll give you an example from our work. This is an infill project, which Todd did in South Orange, New Jersey. And it's a big building. It's replacing a transit parking lot with a type 5 multifamily building. Again, it's trying to do it in a way that scales down. Again, types can try to be bolder and scale up, like when you gang townhouses and put a skin across all of them. That's taking that townhouse type and making it an increment that is larger. This building happens to go the opposite way. It's a 4-story with basement, so 5 stories of residential that steps down to its surroundings and tries to fit in. The plan, the colors all represent different architectures that you can see in the images in the upper right. And then to try to break that building down, have fingers that come out that are lower and scale into the neighborhood. And so there are a lot of ways that that this level of thinking can be brought to bear in and hopefully help empower folks trying to work in infill locations, as in this case. And the 3 images on the left are the new building, by the way. The upper right is the existing context, and and obviously the plan shows the building fitting into that context.
So if that's it, Todd, then I'd like to thank everybody for this great webinar. Our 3 speakers, and Brian and Todd and Matthew, and everybody who participated in this and asked questions. It's really an interesting discussion that we had today. And once again, the book is Increments of Neighborhood, a compendium of built types for walkable and vibrant communities. You really should get this book if you're involved in any way in building urban places. And go to On the Park Bench, CNU.org on the Park Bench to look at upcoming webinars. We got some really interesting ones coming up, and everybody have a great day. Thank you very much.